morning, and welcome to the second day of our Sustainable Future Summit. My name is Jan Chansky, and I'm the Master of Ceremonies for the two-day event. I'm a Senior Policy Editor at Politico, and I'm in charge of sustainability, energy, climate, and mobility coverage. This is the third edition of the Sustainable Future Summit, and we're going to talk today about a whole range of different issues. We're going to talk about the COP26 Climate Summit, the Just Transition Fund, the CO2 border tax, nuclear power, taxonomy, and we're also going to have some interviews with a few top newsmakers. I'd like to thank our partners for making this event possible. Our leading partners, the Coca-Cola in Europe and the Public Power Corporation, and our presenting partners, Cefic, Cisco, EDF, Google, Syngenta, and Whirlpool. Right after this introduction, we'll begin our first panel titled After COP26, What's Next for Climate Action? And that'll be moderated by Carl Matheson, who's our senior climate correspondent and who was the lead of our group of reporters who covered the two-week COP26 summit in Glasgow. First, we'll hear from Nikos Koumettis, President of Europe Coca-Cola, for opening remarks.
Thank you for the introduction. My name is Nikos Koumettis, and I'm President of the Coca-Cola Company's Europe Operating Unit. At Coca-Cola, we want to refresh the world and make a difference. We build love brands done sustainably for a better shared future. That is why we are very happy to be here today to discuss our sustainable shared future. We are a European company. We have been producing our drinks in Europe since 1919, and today we employ 50,000 people in more than 40 European markets and further create 460,000 indirect jobs across our value chain. As a local company with bottling facilities from Antwerp to Zagreb, we share Europe's challenges and ambitions, and we do our part to contribute. People rightly look to us for leadership on circular packaging, on bringing down CO2 emissions, and on reducing the sugar in our drinks. We work to ensure that for our consumers, the healthier and more sustainable choice becomes the easy choice. We support the EU's Green Deal and Farm to Fork strategy ambitions, which is why, just this summer, we signed up to the EU Code of Conduct and outlined our contribution. Our global World Without Waste program aims to help collect and recycle one bottle or can for each one we use by 2030. We actively support well-designed deposit return schemes so our packaging does not end up as litter, but is collected and recycled. Today, we have launched bottles made of 100% recycled PET in 15 European markets, and we will continue to go faster and further. Water is our most important ingredient, and we understand the importance of water stewardship and the link to regenerative farming. Since 2015, we have been globally water positive, meaning that we give more water back to nature than we use in our drinks. For Europe, that number is 240%. These programs and all our other sustainability goals are interconnected and all contribute to our number one challenge, climate change. Climate change is real and will continue to impact our communities and our businesses. And while we offer some drinks with no sugar, we want all our drinks to come with no waste and no emissions. That is why I'm very proud to confirm today that Coca-Cola in Europe has set a target to achieve net zero climate emissions by 2040, a decade ahead of EU's ambition. Our 2040 net zero target builds on work done and announcements already made by our two main European bottlers, Coca-Cola Euro-Pacific Partners and Coca-Cola Hellenic Bottling Company, which allows us to set a common ambition for Coca-Cola in Europe. We have already made progress to reduce our climate footprint. We have introduced bottles made of 100% recycled PET in 15 markets in Europe, with more to come. As packaging accounts for more than 40% of our emissions in Europe, avoiding unnecessary packaging and cutting ourselves free from virgin oil-based plastic packaging will help achieve our 2040 net zero target. We know we have more work to do. Still, one company or one industry or one country cannot achieve our common climate goals alone. In key areas, we need enabling policy frameworks from the EU to provide support and direction. This means accelerating renewable energy investments in packaging, collection infrastructure, and it means supporting innovation. More than ever, today and in the future, we need all parts of society, business, governments, and all European citizens to pull in the same direction. If we do that, we can make the changes we need to achieve our common climate goals. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to following the discussions today. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for joining us. My name's Carl Matheson. I'm the Senior Climate Correspondent at Politico Europe. Welcome to this session, to all of you online and those of you joining us in the room. This session's called After COP26, What's Next for Global Climate Action? Thank you, Nikos Koumettis from Coca-Cola. I thought that was a really interesting statement and kind of draws us into provokes a conversation that we're going to have now, which is about that kind of enabling framework, the policy framework that you talked about. And I just wanted, before we start to talk about, for you guys in the room, but also everybody online, how you can join in, because we have a swap card platform. I think on your seats, if you're in the room, there's some ways to ask questions. On the website that you're joining online, you can go on the swap card platform, tweet to us, Politico, hashtag Politico Sustainability as well. 2 weeks ago in Glasgow, the UN Climate Conference, COP26 finished with a kind of familiar set of headlines, some small steps forward, but really not enough to provide us or guarantee us a safer future. I don't intend this to be a post-mortem of COP26 this morning, but rather we've got an outstanding panel of guests to, I guess, try and look forward and discuss what's next over the next year and in the coming years for the global climate process. How do we look forward? How do we take COP26 forward? Welcome to Minister Grace Fu, who's joining us, I guess, from Singapore. Grace is the Minister for Sustainability and Environment, and she was also the shepherd of a key part of the COP26 talks on carbon markets. Patricia Espinosa, who's the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, who I suppose is joining us from Bonn. Hi, Patricia. Camilla Born, hi. Camilla was the advisor to the UK's COP26 President Alok Sharma and kind of one of the brains behind the whole operation in Glasgow. And in the room, thank you for joining us here, Diederik Samson, who's the head of cabinet for the European Commission's Executive Vice President, Frans Timmermans. One of the critical outcomes that came out of Glasgow was a throw forward just to the next year. There was an admission, I guess, amongst countries that we hadn't seen enough commitments to move the needle towards the goals of 1.5 and 2 degrees that are enshrined in the Paris Agreement. And governments came back and said they will revisit and strengthen their 2030 targets as necessary in the next year. And I wanted to just begin our conversation by trying to outline the political parameters of what that phrase means, because I think that is going to govern a lot of the discussion over the coming 12 months. And because you're with us, you get the first shot, Diederik. I guess I'm curious about how the EU is going to interpret that for yourselves. Is this a signal to the EU that you're going to come back and revisit your own 2030 climate pledge in the next year? And like, how will you interpret that for yourselves?
Well, I can't exclude that, but let me come back to that in a minute. First of all, obviously that sentence was meant for the NDCs that are still lacking. I mean, there's even a few big emitters that haven't submitted an appropriate NDC for 2030, and we all agreed in Glasgow that that needs to happen next year. Actually, that already needed to happen this year. But as always, nothing is perfect. We kept the 1.5 degree alive or inside or on the horizon, whatever words or metaphors you want to use, but we haven't got there yet. And in order to get there, we need to close a gap of about 10 to 15 gigatons of emissions that, well, need to go. And there's a few candidates, big countries, that are going to make up most of that. For the EU, we obviously submitted our NDC in line with climate neutrality, also in line with a -45 worldwide emissions in 2030. So we can consider our NDC appropriate, but we did a little more than that. We also submitted a legislative package to meet the -55 goal for Europe, the Fit for 55 package, and we adopted a climate law. Within that climate law, there is an interesting article that says that, well, it's a bit complicated, but it comes down to the fact that you can only add part of your LULUCF, so your carbon removals, we can only add part of that to the target. Everything we do beyond that is beyond our target. So I can't prejudge where we will end up, but we might end up a little more ambitious than -55. And convenient timing, that might happen at the end of next year, which is when we go into Sharm el-Sheikh. Time-wise, it might also be a little off, so you never know with co-legislators and the trilogues and all the things. So I can't, as I said, we can't run ahead of ourselves, but within the climate law, within our Fit for 55 package, there is the option, and more than just that, there is a real chance that we go further than -55.
Does the political, I mean, we've seen in the last couple of weeks the coalition agreement in Germany, kind of the biggest economy in Europe, advancing a proposal still, but we, feel like it might be agreed in the next week. Is that a shifting of the ground in Germany that gives you the sense that maybe things in Europe might really move over the next year and open up that space for you?
Well, it will make the closure of the Fit for 55 package more realistic. So we have now a government that provides a real amount of tailwind, so to speak, for this whole endeavor. I'm not sure whether in percentages what it means, but again, we certainly aim higher than the -55. The climate law also tells us to do at least -55. So who knows where we will end up? And obviously, if the European Union as a bloc, as a big emitter, walks into Egypt next year with even a higher ambition than we went for last year, it might send a signal also to the rest of the world about ratcheting up your ambitions in order to, well, save our climate.
Minister Fu, Singapore is a developing country, but a relatively rich one, and currently your timeline for peaking emissions is roughly the same as China, around 2030, as I understand. Do you have the sense that this outcome from Glasgow compels you to revisit your targets in the next year?
I think, first of all, I'd like to say that Singapore always treats its obligations under multilateral framework seriously. So when the COP required us to submit an NDC and LEDS in 2020, that's what we did. We're one of the first few that have submitted an NDCs, and that is after going through a very comprehensive engagement sessions domestically and getting the budget and so on for it. So when we are faced with this decision that's taken at COP26, then obviously we have to do our part as a global citizen. We will take this obligation very seriously. We'll review our long-term strategy again and look at ways to improve our NDCs. We will do that with full engagement with all our stakeholders, and we hope to come up with something even better for the climate. We don't take these pledges or strategies lightly, because when in Singapore we said that we will do it, we will do it. And I think it is important to back up the pledges with deeds. And I think that's really a start of COP26, is to have the pledges, but more importantly is to show that there's a pathway and there's a real intention to get those pledges being brought into reality. So in a way, this is a good outcome for COP26. It's a decision taken by all parties to review and improve their NDCs and to do an interim, update or upgrade by the next COP.
Camilla, this has got to be kind of music to your ears, hearing these countries begin to sort of thinking about next year in a way that they're feeling compelled. Your role as the UK presidency goes on now for another year until you hand over to the Egyptians in November or whenever they decide to have the COP next year. So how will you use the next year as a presidency to, I guess, try and push on and pressure some of the countries, I guess, that Diederik was alluding to, and I guess in that way we are talking about China, but there are other countries, emerging economies, that have not increased their NDC. What's the plan that's emerging from London?
So I think we built up a huge amount of goodwill with countries going into COP26, and certainly that political space that we created allowed us to deliver the outcome in the end. And the fact that all countries came together and looked each other in the eyes, stood shoulder to shoulder, which was no mean feat in the middle of a global pandemic, but was certainly worth it, allowed them to recognize that we needed to go further. And that was informed by science, that was informed by experience. I mean, look out the window, the weather is changing rapidly. And there was a necessary understanding that this is also possible. Many economies are moving in that direction. Every minister that we spoke to all around the world, they really understood that if they wanted to be a modern and competitive economy, this was the direction they wanted to go in. So we will continue to build on those relationships that we built over the last year and explore where we might be able to go further. And this will continue to be rooted and grounded in science. There is a clear look from many countries into the science and what that means for themselves. And I think that is at the root of where you answer the question of what is necessary. And I think understanding where is our NDC on that necessary spectrum? Where do we need to go? How do we think about that for our economy? What opportunities can be taken for going further will be really at the heart of how we want to engage with countries and make sure that moves forward. Of course, the Egyptians are the incoming presidency, and they will have an understanding about what they want to achieve with their COP into COP27. So we will work very closely with them and explore how we can best complement one another, supporting our presidency year, but also giving space to that incoming presidency as we had from the Chileans.
Patricia Espinosa, you've been the custodian of this process for a number of years and involved in it for a long time. I'm curious how you see the process evolving at the moment. If some things about COP26 felt different to other COPs, and I wondered if there was a single thing that you could point to that felt like a new innovation or something different about COP26, what it would be.
Well, that's a difficult question, given that climate change is such a complex and cross-cutting issue. It really touches every aspect of society, every area, every sector of the economy. But I would highlight the fact that COP26 was really the most important COP since the Paris Agreement was adopted. It was also the one that created the highest expectations. The expectations going into COP26 could not have been higher. Now, the outcome, I would say it was not a conference that could have solved for once the issue of climate change, the big challenge of humanity, climate change. And that was maybe an expectation by in some areas of society that was clearly something that was impossible to achieve. But I do think that this was a very important step forward. You asked what felt different from other COPs. One thing that I would highlight was the fact that we did manage to finalize the rule book. So now we have a Paris Agreement that is fully implementable, and that is a very major step forward. Of course, it's difficult to transmit that to the general public because it involves many technical issues, but in fact, it allows us to have much more tools to support countries, but also to ask from countries more ambition. On the other side, one different conversation that I would want to highlight was around finance and adaptation and loss and damage. Finance, for the first time, we got a very clear recognition by all countries, all developed and developing, that more support to developing countries needs to be provided if we want to have them really joining and making all the efforts that are needed in order to reach the 1.5 goal. And there was a clear recognition by developed countries that they had failed to deliver on the 100 billion goal that was supposed to be delivered by 2020. There were strong calls and yes, clear disappointment that this goal was not achieved. At the same time, we now have within our process a work program, if we want to call it somehow, or a work path regarding finance for climate change, including for adaptation and loss and damage. That was different from other COPs.
I want to come back to the finance issue because that's obviously something that a lot of our panelists will want to weigh in on. But you raised the issue of expectations, and it was striking to see even during the conference a kind of two interpretations of what this process is. We want this process to deliver. We had in the first week Greta Thunberg declaring the conference a failure and a festival of greenwashing, and I think that was striking too, because she's expressing something that you're noting, which is that the expectation is that governments of the world come together and stop climate change. And I guess I'm curious about if this process can't deliver on that expectation, and I'd ask you, Patricia, but then I'd open it to the rest of the panelists. Where does the political change come from that will answer the overall question of how do we stop this?
So we know that in order to avoid the worst consequences of climate change, according to science, we need to reach the 1.5 degree goal by the end of the century. Now, this is clearly our guiding objective. Now, what do we do? What do we need to do now? We need to have as many ambitious plans as possible so that by 2030, we are able to reduce overall global emissions by 45%. And we went into the conference knowing that we did not have the minus 45%, that we actually had an increase in emissions by 2030. So that was really a big challenge. How can we give out of this conference a sense of hope if we know that we are so far away from our goal? Now, the process is precisely that. It is a process. It is a process of transformation. We need to be very clear that what we're talking about is going from a process that it started with the Industrial Revolution until today, and now we need to change that. We need to change, and that involves also consumption and production patterns. That involves also the transforming production, industrial production everywhere in the world. So it is a process. We need to be very, very clear that this is not going to happen overnight. And one single conference cannot do that. But the conferences that take place every year, what they can do, and they have to do, that's their objective, is to define what are going to be the actions that need to be taken by governments. As you know, the Paris Agreement had established a 5-year cycle for reports regarding reduction of emissions. At this conference, for example, looking at the reality that is we are so far away from the minus 45 emissions by 2030, the decision was taken that governments should make of the NDCs a continuous process of revision, always looking for areas of improvement. Why? Because otherwise we won't make it by 2030 with the minus 45. And that means all countries, even those that have already presented very, very ambitious goals, like the European Union. And I'm sorry, I could not hear, we had some technical problems, I could not hear all the comments by our colleague from the European Union, but that includes really everybody.
Diederik or anybody else on the panel, do you want to weigh in on this sort of where this process takes its next steps? Or Diederik maybe first, and then Grace, and then Camilla. We'll all go.
You can already book your next 28 COPs. Maybe we tone down on the rhythm at some point in time, but this will be with us until way in the next half of this century. This is a process. And that's also always a dilemma for every COP and also for the presidency of a COP, how to calibrate the expectation game. And there's that dilemma. In order to get a good result, you need to ratchet up the expectations big time, because you need to put the pressure on the participants, the political pressure on those countries and the big emitters to step forward. But on the other hand, if you want to prevent a failure, and every presidency wants to prevent a failure of its COP, you need to sort of, play the expectation game the other way around. And you always see that. Also running into Glasgow, we saw that. At some point, it was the COP of COPs. It would be the final COP that would save the world. And going into Glasgow, we heard the presidency obviously saying, well, keep it 1.5 degrees alive is our goal, which is already a little toned down. And I think that's exactly, and you will see that for every COP. And then obviously part of that, let's say, that culture is also that some people will declare the COP a failure before it even started, or they will declare it a failure whatever happens at the end, or they will declare it a success, whatever happens at the end. You could strike those, I mean, you can always include all those sounds. I tend to listen to the real analysts and tend to look at the real result, and I think Glasgow wasn't too bad in that sense.
Yeah, it strikes me that the success or failure narrative around COPs isn't particularly useful. Minister Fu, do we need another, not a parallel process, but is there other places for this political energy and political change to happen?
Well, actually, I want to say that, using the analogy that the glass half full or half empty, actually COP has not left any cups empty. Everyone gone away with some. No one went away with everything, not planet Earth, not climate action. We didn't get the full cup, but I think we didn't go away with the empty cup either. And, you know, when we look at many of the issues, it points back to finance, whether it's on ambition, helping developing countries to mitigate, to adapt, or whether to do reporting, enhance transparency, somehow it leads back to finance. And I like to say that that's where I think we should really sometimes think out of the box. And in this rule book segment, I'm glad to say that we have, you know, basically untied knots about standards, about having high standards in carbon credit projects, at the same time generating resources, a new form of resources for countries that have those resources in renewables or in climate-based, in nature-based solutions. And Article 6 basically allows the functioning, proper functioning of the global credit market, making sure that there's no double counting, that's standards, that's baseline in the technology that we're going to use in the calculation and in the measurements of the carbon credits. And there is, I think, a small achievement, but I think a significant achievement in designating 5% of the sales of proceeds to adaptation finance, generating a source of income to put into adaptation finance to help developing countries, either with mitigation, adaptation, or loss and damage. This is important. As my previous colleagues have said, though, we may not think that it's sufficient yet, but I think it's an important foundation on which we build on further collaborations. And by doing so, I think it sends a signal that there's a framework. Obviously, there's a lot more work needs to be done, because I think what we have agreed at Paris in Glasgow, really, it's a way that we will broad agreement on the framework and on principles, but to operationalize that, there are going to be many, many months, if not years, of discussions on how we can, you know, get the implementation details out. But it's an important achievement because 190 countries agreeing on how to account for the carbon credits across all markets, across all sectors. I think it's an important move, and it allows for the ambitious companies, countries to move ahead of their targets by assessing this new way of managing their carbon emissions.
Camilla, is there any way that the process itself needs to change and adapt beyond COP26 and into the future?
So in many ways, I'd say that we already rolled the dice a little bit on trying to adapt the COPs. I mean, I think the first time I went to the UN, I sort of thought, oh, perhaps the UN can do something. And of course the UN can do something. But what it does is it facilitates countries doing things. And the presidency is a really interesting role because you have all of the responsibility, but very few of the levers. You're dependent on the political choices, the economic choices that are being made by countries around the world, as it should be. I mean, this is a big economic, social, cultural, political change we're trying to facilitate. So it's completely understandable that is the way. But I think people conflate, should this process find the answers? No, the countries through this process find the answers, and they are the limiting and the enabling factor. In terms of how we move the process forward, what we understood was that countries, companies, citizens, investors, they wanted that certainty that comes from the targets, the NDCs. And we've got to remember, these NDCs are still new. I was part of the Paris Agreement process, and we hoped the Paris Agreement would work, but we didn't know it would work. We don't have many copies of agreements like this that set long-term goals, that on a 5-yearly cycle, crank down, or crank up, I should say, ambition to do further crank down emissions. And we didn't know if it would work. So the first thing that we did was make the Paris Agreement work. And I think that will be the flavor that goes forward in future COPs. Well, we didn't, as I said, countries did. But the other thing that we did was that, yes, people wanted those targets, but they also wanted to see progress on specific sectors. And I think we opened up that conversation that allowed for discussion on specific sectors, small plurilateral approaches that could move the conversation forward. And the appetite for that was really strong, stronger than we perhaps thought. And I think that could be something that rolls forward into future COPs as well.
Yeah, the first week of the COP was marked by this, jamboree of announcements that were bewildering in some ways, exciting, but also the question that immediately came was, well, how can we be sure that the countries that are signing up to these commitments are going to fulfill them over the years I mean, some of these commitments are quite long term. I'd open this to the panel, and if anyone wants to weigh in on what are the mechanisms, and are there discussions being had already around how you capture that first week of COP and put it either into the UN process or alongside the UN process to give it that accountability that we need, because otherwise it's going to be. I'm going to be very busy, and a lot of our colleagues in the civil society sector are going to be very busy trying to check up on all of this. And I think it also behooves governments to put a brake on that. And otherwise, we do end up in a greenwashing scenario.
I must admit I was a bit skeptical and also a little wary of that jamboree in the first week, also because in the EU we have quite a cumbersome process to sign up on all those things, because we need 27 member states and all other factors to be included. So, but I changed my mind on this, and I have to applaud or compliment the presidency for organizing this, because it was a real, let's say, effective warm-up round. It provided momentum, it provided some energy, it provided other stakeholders that are not part of the formal process of the UNFCCC to also really engage with this. And obviously, we will see a few of those, I think it was in the end 27 of those declarations and leader statements and whatever. We will see a few of those fall off the wagon somewhere. And that's not a disaster. I mean, what it did was provide momentum and energy and impetus to the formal process, the NDCs and the UNFCCC framework. So it really worked. I mean, it was a hell of a job, and especially, I think, more for the presidency. So again, compliments to you. But for an organization or a governance body like the EU, it was obviously hellish to get all those declarations. And I think we got a few. We missed a few because of that, but it was a nice way to start a COP. So if the next presidency can muster the courage and also the time and energy to do that again, I wouldn't be against it.
I may.
Yes, please, Patricia.
Yes, regarding the announcements, and especially by private sector, by non-party stakeholders, not only private sector, but also cities and academia and other actors. We've been working since Paris within the UNFCCC framework in what we call global climate action. We have a global climate action platform that registers all these pledges and commitments. We are in the process of enhancing that platform in order to make it able to actually follow up, make a checkup of all the different commitments. We do some of it with the help of many other partners that are following up on commitments on specific sectors, but we are conscious that we need to increase it. Regarding, for example, the Race to Zero, and a process that was launched by the champions from Chile and the UK. They have engaged a group of experts in order to define criteria for accessing the Race to Zero initiative, and also to check on the different applications. So we are also going to continue working with them on this. The Secretary General announced that he will be putting together an expert group in order to look at these pledges, make them, make sure that they are credible and that people are accountable. So yes, it's certainly an area of opportunity where we need to expand our work, and we'll be doing that.
I want to move on to, Minister Fu, I was going to ask you a question about finance, but if you want to, in your response to...
That's okay.
The conference in COP26 was notable in terms of advancing some discussions on both adaptation finance, the longer term goals of delivering finance to developing countries, and also opening up a discussion on the loss and damage that's caused by climate change and how countries rebuild and communities rebuild. I'm curious, from the perspective of a developing country, what you want to see at COP27 in terms of those discussions becoming more concrete. What are the kind of specifics around the positions that the developing country bloc is going to take up?
Yeah, obviously, from the developing countries' point of view, the support for adaptation, loss and damage, as well as mitigation is very important. So I think in the COP26, there has been a lot of call about stepping up of financing to support them. And they would also like to know transparency. I think, as you have rightly put, there's accountability from the developed countries towards their financial commitment. The developing countries would like to know in what form has those finances been extended or will be extended. Is it going to be a loan in which is repayable, or is it going to be a grant, or is it in some other form of support? They would also like to know whether it is for mitigation, for adaptation, or for loss and damage. Because obviously, especially for Singapore, we are in part of the Alliance for Small Island States. For many of the small island states, large-scale financeable, commercially viable mitigation projects may not be present. And in some cases, adaptation is already needed. It's not when, some years down the road, they are already inundated. And of course, some of them have already suffered loss and damage. So for these countries, for my colleagues in the AOSIS, understanding how they can access these financings, and also what are the requirements, transparency in the criteria. These are all very important factors for them. So those were one area where there were calls and there were loud calls. But as I said, going forward, it's really about reporting, about being accountable and reporting into UNFCCC about the sources of finance and how we can set clearer expectations of those finance. Developing countries have to do their part as well, because when we talked about adaptation standards, what would appear as a good standard of resilience, I think we are not clear. And that's why in COP26, we have set up a work program to decide what will be good adaptation practices. And with that, then I think it gives the developed countries a clearer picture about how the finances will be used. This is always, a need for continual discussions and also to build trusting relations so that there is clear understanding of where the finances are coming from, and also clear accountability for how the finances are being used. So I would just say that I am pretty sure that adaptation will continue to be an important theme of discussion and negotiations. Particularly, I think, for the next COP, where it's held in Africa, in Egypt, I expect it will be high on the agenda.
Yeah, the Egyptians have said that adaptation and resilience are kind of the themes of their COP. When you can't adapt to the impacts of climate change and communities get damaged, this is what we refer to as loss and damage in the climate talks, and it's long been a fraught discussion. There was an interesting innovation at COP26 or around COP26 when the Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon delivered $2 million specifically to fund loss and damage, and this was kind of a first. She called it an act of reparation, and I just wondered, Diederik, do you think the rich world owes poorest countries in the world compensation for the damage caused by climate change?
Well, we certainly owe the rest of the world our help in repairing damage. you might even argue that repairing damage, whatever the cause is, by the way. So, but obviously going into that reparation type of discussion is quite toxic in some parts of the Western world. So what I think, I mean, what we have experienced also in Glasgow, but also before in all the other COPs up to Glasgow, is that we are only now scratching the surface of our financial framework. We've sort of put off that real discussion by committing to 100 billion, which was 100 billion. It was just a big number, and it's real money, so it helps. So it indeed bought us some time in order to get it right. And in order to get it right, we don't have that much time anymore. So what we need to do is really go into the difficult discussions, the things that are off limits so far. For instance, loss and damage. I think let's say the Western or the rich part of the world needs to get its act together on how far we think we can go and we want to go and under what conditions. On the other thing, which is off limits also in parts of the discussion, is obviously the donor base. I mean, we're not in 1992 anymore. So there's a completely different world with a different set of countries that are eligible to also pay in to this whole climate finance framework. I think if all partners, all countries, all participants are willing and able to go beyond their normal limits and go to the area which was off limits for them, so for China, being part of the donor base is off limits right now. Why should it be in the future? For the US, talking about loss and damage and some responsibility for that is off limits for them. Why should it be in the future? For both and also for the EU, it's going to be a very difficult discussion, but one that we can't put off any longer. And it will start in Egypt, I can tell you. It will be all about that in Egypt. So Egypt will be another high-profile political discussion. It's not just about numbers, it's about responsibility. And that's much more difficult.
I wondered if we've got about 5 minutes left, and there's one question from the audience that has come up. We've all been a bit quiet, but I wanted to just ask Camilla and Patricia about this issue of broadly finance adaptation and the transfer of wealth from the richest countries in the world to the most vulnerable and the ones that are trying to change their economies. Is this where the negotiation goes now? We've kind of got in place the mechanisms for ambition. Whether countries will fulfill it or not is still an open question. But it seems that there's an imbalance between where the discussion is at on mitigation of emissions compared to how we help the poorest countries. Do you think the next decade is going to be a series of negotiations around the transfer of wealth?
Perhaps I can come in on that first. I mean, I think one of the positive things about the COP26 is that we did have a conversation about how countries were going to collaborate together more around responding to climate impacts. And we've known it in the science, but the reality of it, I think, is changing the politics and changing the nature of the discussion. One thing I think is particularly interesting in the loss and damage conversation, it has become very stuck over the years because of this conversation around compensation, reparations, et cetera, and I think we moved into a much more practical space where we don't want to have an ideological conversation that gums up the system. We want to have a discussion about how do we practically collaborate to move this forward. And I think that's exactly the kind of approach that we need to see more of. I think the other thing that I would comment on is that countries need to do their homework on this. We have a process now in place where countries do their homework on their mitigation. Some do it on adaptation, but perhaps not enough, you could argue. And on adaptation and on loss and damage, there is more homework to be done, not only at home domestically, but also with key partners. So if you are a country in a particular region, how can you talk to your neighbours about how you can work together to deal with these new issues? And I think the UNFCCC process needs to send these stronger signals on these different elements. You have to remember the UNFCCC is not an agency. It doesn't do action itself. It facilitates, it sets the agenda, it moves countries forward. And it's very powerful in doing that. It allows governments to move forward. And that's really positive. The other thing that I just comment on as we only have a few minutes left is that one of the big shifts we saw through the negotiations this time is that shift from the 100 billion, which is a big number, but it's not that big a number commensurate with what we're trying to achieve. And what we did see was a shift from perhaps just Europeans and some others saying we want to shift the trillions to all countries saying they want to shift the trillions and they want to move the financial framework in that direction. And I do think that adaptation, resilience, loss and damage, as well as mitigation will need to be part of that conversation. And it is clear that there is appetite from a whole range of countries, not just in this sort of slightly old-fashioned now, as Diederik was saying, developing of 1992, but a much more structural conversation of what the future looks like and how we'll work together to make that happen.
We are running out of time, but if you want to come in, Patricia.
Just to make a quick comment, the way I see it is I think we need to remind ourselves that the climate regime has basically three pillars. One is mitigation, another one is adaptation, and support, means of implementation, which means finance, technology, and capacity building. And all these three pillars are interlinked. The fact that since the beginning, our regime contemplates an obligation from developed countries to support developing countries has to do with the way that developed countries were able to develop, to grow, to create wealth, without any restrictions in the use of resources, which is not the case now, which is not what countries will be able to do now. So I would agree with you that we need to see more balance. On the one hand, we have clarity on where we need to be in regarding mitigation. But for that to happen, and especially in the case of the developing world, we need to have more support for developing countries. And that includes the negotiation that we need to start now regarding the new global goal on finance. The 100 billion was a figure that was agreed until 2025. Now we need to define a new figure from 2025 onwards. It's not only about money, but also about technology and capacity building. And then adaptation. And adaptation itself also requires the finance. So yes, in my view, it will have to do a lot with creating this balance. Okay, the only way to move forward in this agenda is to move the three pillars of the agenda at the same time. Over to you.
Thanks, Patricia. We're actually pretty much out of time. I just have one more question to you because you've been through this. Your tenure has been a tumultuous one. It incorporated the Trump presidency and things like that. I was just wondering if you're planning on staying on and seeking a third term next year.
Well, I'm just recovering from COP26, so I think this is not yet. I've not been into that reflection yet. Okay. All of our panelists, thank you so much for joining us. And for me, this is an interest. I think that COPs and climate change are so complex. So thank you for sort of picking out some of the key themes. I don't think we've covered it all, and that would be an hours and hours long discussion. But I appreciate so much your time, your thoughts, your coming in and seeing us in person, Diederik, and to you guys in the audience for coming in personally. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the conference. My colleague Aitor is going to host a really interesting panel on just transition next, so stick around for that. And I'll say goodbye to you all. Thank you very much.